Hello there guys and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video we're going to be talking about RE-Parry, and before we get any further, I already know that I think Legacy has a quite good video on this where he expands it in a quite big detail about how to get it done and where it is useful. So I will leave a link to that video in the video description. Reason I'm making this one myself at the moment is because quite a few people have requested for it, and also a great bit of kind of like news is that now with Abyss of Legends there is Iron Man Infinity War as the first fight on the right side, on the right path, which is an excellent place where you can go and practice your RE-Parry techniques, especially because it is extremely useful in Abyss itself as well. So now let's check it out in slow motion and try and figure out what and how it is happening. So after this sequence, we're going to see here, heavily slowed down. So we do pretty much parry the first hit, but we try to make it kind of slightly on the earlier side, because the parry window is actually fairly big once you kind of get used to it. But with these parries, you try to drop that parry somewhat slightly prematurely a bit. Even if you miss the first parry and that ends up being just a hit in the block, that is still perfectly fine, because that quite often can even make it easier for you. And as you can see from animation, there isn't a high uptime of us dropping that block at all. It's much more like a slight muscle twitch. You just need to make sure that you do lift up your finger from the screen at least for a split second. Quite often animations don't even have properly time to react to it, because as we can see here, it pretty much looks like I'm holding a block steady and stable, but in fact I do twitch my muscle for a brief moment, and basically I just kind of let go of the screen and apply the block once again. Now it is largely on kind of like your own muscle memory and experience, and it does take quite a bit of getting used to, but it's one of those little things that will help you throughout the contest, especially considering how many of the new champions occasionally are relatively tricky to parry. Even the Stealth Suit Spider-Man can be tricky to parry. Nova is a new champion, Havoc, Ebony Maw, Iron Man Infinity War, obviously, so on and so forth. So it is a really kind of handy and useful trick, especially considering how many of them are relatively difficult defenders to tackle. But again, so basically what you want to do is you want to land your first parry kind of a bit earlier on than you might normally do it, or even let opponent hit in the block. Then quickly have a little muscle twitch, lift your finger off the screen and press it back up, because the second hit is the one that you can actually parry an opponent with, and then it works out pretty much perfectly for you. Now, there are obviously many upsides to learning this technique, as the main one kind of being is getting the openings that otherwise would be much harder to get. And another important thing is you can keep higher tempo in these fights, because your other alternatives are either to rely on intercept, punishing special attacks, or just taking a lot of block damage and baiting out heavy attacks, right? So neither of those are really kind of high speed and cost-effective techniques, if I should say so, because yes, intercepts can work out perfectly, but there is a larger element of risk involved, and block baiting heavy attacks just overall ends up being quite expensive over time. So it's definitely worth learning how to do this properly and then use it whenever you have the chance, especially once you get more used and more accustomed to it. But this is one of those things where practice makes perfect. And I will have like a couple of more other fights coming out with different champions against this Iron Man Infinity War. You're going to see some of the times where I fail. You're going to see some of the times where instead of going for the second medium hit, opponent decides to throw their heavy attack, which still is perfectly cool for vast majority of the situations, because if he does decide to throw his heavy attack, then obviously that also gives you an opening and you can retaliate with a heavy attack of your own or start up a combo or whatever else might be needed. And another but demonstration I wanted to show was with Warlock, because Warlock kind of thrives with that whole RE-Parry thing, because whenever you do parry a projectile attack, or block a projectile attack with Warlock, then you also drain opponent's power and you activate your Sig ability and you start dealing damage. And it's just a really effective technique overall for Warlock to use to kind of like control opponent's power extremely well, plus find the openings in on your opponent and do damage and kind of like make it fight even better than it would be against an opponent where you can normally and simply parry stun them. So your Warlock is a definite champion that benefits from learning this ability quite a lot and makes many fights quite a bit easier. And as I briefly mentioned before, now you have a perfect place where you can go and practice your RE-Parries in Abyss of Legends, because opponent has huge health pool, opponent is easily kind of like achievable because it doesn't take much energy to get there, and also opponent doesn't really have the highest attack, so even when you mess up you will have like chance to pick yourself together and try again and try again. And overall you're just going to be much better off whenever you're going to be fighting any and all Iron Man Infinity Wars in your future, because he is one of the champions that people quite often struggle in Alliance War. I don't remember if he's in Alliance Quest, but still, hey, if he's there, you're going to be better off fighting them, so on and so forth. Obviously, many different Iron Man Infinity Wars are there throughout the contest. He is one of the bosses in 6.3 as well, and he's a quite tricky boss there, and you definitely want to minimize the block damage you take from 6.3 Iron Man Infinity War boss, because they have really jacked up attacks. And here we can see that with Hyperion, even if our RE-Parry doesn't happen because Iron Man goes for a heavy attack, it is still relatively easy and simple for you to kind of like abuse those mechanics and just drop your special attacks, find your openings that way. And Hyperion kind of like thrives on ability whenever he can heavy opponents, because that gives him all the furies he needs and increase his damage, so on and so forth. So as you can see, even though like our health is dipping down by recoil, all in all we're not taking like any block damage from the Iron Man, or well, hardly any damage, and we are able to maintain an aggressive pace in the fight. And yeah, it is actually a relatively simple fight, even though we cannot punish Iron Man Infinity War special attacks, even though he's technically trickier to parry. It is still a simple, straightforward fight once you learn how to RE-Parry. And that would be the same case for when you're facing a Havoc, an Ebony Maw, possibly and probably Nova in future, especially if you're using champions who do a lot of heavy spamming, heavy countering tactics, because then you can pretty much ignore Nova's auto block ability as well by dropping your heavies. And all in all, it's just one of those super helpful things for you to know, for you to be aware of, for you to learn, just like parry itself, just like intercept, just like countering opponents with heavy attacks, and so on and so forth. Sidestepping, for example, is another like good technique to have, and this is just yet another little trick that might help you throughout the rest of your MCOC playing days, which is pretty much one of the reasons why I like this game to begin with, at least so much, just because there are a lot of little tips and tricks and interactions in between champions and some different fighting techniques and some different cheese methods, and the more you know, the easier the game gets for you. And quite often some fights that someone finds extremely difficult or tricky or irritating are one of these little small tricks away to becoming very simple, straightforward, and relatively user-friendly experience. So whenever you do struggle with a fight, and that will happen, that happens with all of us, that will pretty much be kind of like my biggest and best advice. Do try your best to kind of like look up as much information and seek advice, either in line groups or on YouTube, so on and so forth, because for most part, aside from, I don't know, maybe a dozen fights or a couple of dozen fights in this game total, every single fight has decent counters, has ways around it, has options who you can use or tricks that you need to learn how to make those fights easy. So even if they do not seem easy at the beginning, chances are there is a small tip, trick, technique, matchup available for you to make this fight relatively simple. But now that hopefully I have successfully stalled you here long enough to reach the 10-minute mark, have you sit through a couple of advertisements in order to get that ad money, I will say goodbye. That is pretty much it for today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, if you found it useful, then definitely hit that like button. I will try and leave a link to Legacy's video in video description below, so you guys can check that out as well. And yeah, do not forget to leave a comment, drop that like, hit that sub button, hit all the good buttons, and I'll catch you guys soon. See ya.